The flashlight beam swung hard across his face before he'd even set the coffee thermos down on the tailgate, and the man holding it was already talking before introducing himself, already reciting rule numbers from a binder he hadn't opened, already certain of an authority that, as it would turn out, he never legally possessed. 2 more vehicles idled behind him on the gravel, headlights washing out the dark, doors left open in a way meant to look official. He would be told to leave his own land within the hour. He would refuse. And what happened over the next 4 months, the letters, the fences, the courtroom, the collapse of a man's entire self-invented kingdom would end with a lesson none of them saw coming. Thomas Greer was 58 years old, and the land beneath his boots that night had never belonged to anyone outside his family. His grandfather, Ellis Greer, had cleared the first 11 acres of it by hand in 1951, driving fence posts through Georgia clay with a mule named Duke and a stubbornness that, according to family lore, had never once bent to a neighbor's opinion. Thomas's father, Raymond, had expanded the holding to 62 acres through the 70s and 80s, adding a modest cattle operation and a pond he dug himself, and had passed the deed to Thomas in 1998 with nothing more ceremonial than a handshake and a warning to keep the taxes current. Thomas had spent his adult life doing exactly that, running a small hay and timber operation, keeping to himself, waving at passing trucks, and paying every county assessment a full month before it was due, a habit he'd inherited along with the land itself. He was not, by any honest account, a difficult man. He was quiet in the way that people mistake for weakness until they test it, soft-spoken at the feed store, generous with fence-mending help to neighbors who needed it, and entirely uninterested in conflict of any kind, which was, in the end, precisely what made him such an unlikely and such a devastating opponent. The land itself, before any of this began, existed in a kind of settled equilibrium that Thomas had worked 2 decades to maintain. 62 acres of rolling pasture and hardwood tree line, a spring-fed pond stocked with base his father had introduced in 1979, a 2-story farmhouse with a wraparound porch that Ellis had built board by board, and a gravel access road running along the property's northern edge that had existed, undisturbed and unchallenged, since before the subdivision next door had a name. Thomas grew hay in the open fields, sold cordwood in the winter, and kept 4 head of cattle more out of habit than profit. It was, by any reasonable measure, a peaceful life, self-sufficient and largely invisible to the outside world until the outside world arrived in the form of a new subdivision called Millbrook Farms Estates, built on the adjoining 300 acres starting in 2019, and until the outside world found a voice in a woman named Denise Holloway. Denise Holloway was 46, recently elected president of the Millbrook Farms Homeowners Association, and possessed of a particular kind of ambition that treated a volunteer board seat as though it were a mayoral office. She had moved into Millbrook 2 years prior, run for the board on a platform of protecting property values, and won by a narrow margin against a retiree who hadn't bothered campaigning. Within months of taking the presidency, she had formed what she called the Millbrook Community Standards Patrol, a self-appointed group of 4 residents, unpaid and entirely without legal enforcement authority, who drove the neighborhood's perimeter roads in personal trucks fitted with magnetic HOA patrolled door decals she'd ordered online. It was, on paper, meant to monitor landscaping violations within the subdivision itself. In practice, and increasingly, it did not stay within the subdivision's actual boundary, a boundary that, as recorded in the county plat map filed in 1997, ran nearly 40 feet inside Millbrook's own property line and nowhere near Thomas Greer's gravel road at all. The first letter arrived on a Tuesday in March, taped to Thomas's mailbox rather than mailed, printed on Millbrook HOA letterhead despite the fact that Thomas had never joined, never signed a covenant, and never owned property within the association's recorded boundaries. It cited him for unauthorized commercial vehicle storage, his father's old flatbed truck, parked where it had sat for 11 years, and demanded compliance within 10 days or face a fine. Thomas read it twice, folded it carefully, and placed it in a manila folder he labeled, without any particular emotion, Millbrook Correspondence. He did not call. He did not argue. He simply photographed the truck, the date, and the letter itself, and filed it away, the way his father had always told him to handle anything with someone else's letterhead on it, quietly, and with proof. A second letter came 2 weeks later, this one about firewood stacked in view of the roadway, and a third the week after that, citing a fence line that Denise's patrol had apparently measured themselves and declared to be encroaching on shared right-of-way, a right-of-way that did not exist on any survey Thomas had ever seen, including the one his father had commissioned in 1988. Each time, Thomas responded the same way, no confrontation, no phone calls, just a photograph, a date, and a folder growing steadily thicker on the kitchen table, a quiet accumulation that Denise Holloway, sitting in her home office drafting citations on association letterhead she had no legal claim to extend past her own subdivision's line, could not yet see coming, and would not understand the weight of until it was far too late to matter. By April, the letters had stopped satisfying Denise Holloway, and anyone who had watched her closely over those first weeks might have noticed the shift. A woman who had begun the year citing landscaping infractions now speaking of Thomas Greer at HOA meetings as though he were a personal affront to the neighborhood's character, a holdout, an obstacle to the cohesive community vision she'd promised voters during her campaign. She began recruiting. 2 of the patrol's original 4 members had quietly stepped back by then, uneasy with citations being issued to a property outside their own boundary, but Denise replaced them easily enough with a retired insurance adjuster named Gary Pruitt, who liked the authority of the decal on his truck door more than he cared about its legal weight, and a younger resident named Ashley Cobb, who filmed everything for a neighborhood Facebook group with 1,600 members and a growing appetite for drama. At the May HOA meeting, held in the clubhouse under fluorescent lighting and a banner reading Millbrook Farms, Pride in Every Property, Denise stood at the podium and read a prepared statement about a long-standing non-compliant property adjacent to our community that was, in her words, creating safety hazards, lowering surrounding home values, and refusing repeated good faith requests for cooperation. She did not use Thomas's name, she didn't need to. Everyone in the room who lived along the northern edge of Millbrook knew exactly whose land bordered the gravel road. Murmurs went through the crowd. A show of hands followed, non-binding and legally meaningless, but effective theater, with Denise closing the meeting by promising the board would explore all available options to bring the property into compliance. Thomas wasn't there. He hadn't been invited, wasn't a member, and hadn't even known the meeting was happening until a neighbor, an older man named Curtis Weaver who'd farmed 2 properties down since before Millbrook existed, mentioned it to him over the fence a few days later with an apologetic shake of his head. "They're talking about you like you're the problem," Curtis said. "Wanted you to know." Thomas thanked him, said little else, and went back to fixing the latch on his equipment shed. But something in him had started, quietly and without drama, to shift, not toward anger, which was never really in his nature, but toward a kind of clear-eyed resolve, the sort of patient man arrives at only after he's certain patience alone won't be enough. The real damage came in June, and it came without warning, the way damage often does when the person causing it has convinced themselves they're not really doing anything wrong. Thomas returned from a supply run to town on a Thursday afternoon to find the gravel access road along his property's northern edge, the same 40-foot stretch his father had graded and maintained since 1979, torn up in 3 places by what he'd later learn was a rented skid steer, deep gouges cut into the roadbed under the justification, scrawled later in an email by Denise Holloway, that the road was presumed shared infrastructure requiring HOA-directed maintenance access. No permit had been pulled. No survey had been consulted. The gouges had severed an underground irrigation line Raymond Greer had installed in 1991 to feed the lower pasture, a break that would cost Thomas $4,200 to excavate and repair, and had cracked the culvert pipe beneath the road's drainage crossing, a repair that ran another $1,800 once the county inspector he called out confirmed the damage. Beyond the dollar figures, which Thomas documented meticulously with itemized contractor invoices and time-stamped photographs, there was the matter of 6 mature white oaks along the road's edge, trees his grandfather had planted as a windbreak in 1958, 3 of which had root systems torn and destabilized by the equipment, trees that an arborist would later confirm were unlikely to survive another 2 seasons. It was the irrigation line, more than anything, that finally moved Thomas to call an attorney, not out of panic, but out of the same steady practicality that had guided every folder, every photograph, every dated letter he'd saved since March. He drove into town and met with Rosalind Cho, a property and land use attorney who'd handled 2 boundary disputes for Curtis Weaver years earlier and came recommended with the kind of quiet confidence Thomas trusted more than any advertisement could have earned. She spread his documentation across her conference table, the citation letters, the plat map from 1997, his father's 1988 survey, the itemized repair invoices, and worked through it in near silence for the better part of 40 minutes before finally sitting back in her chair. "None of this holds up," she said. "Your property was never annexed into the Millbrook Covenant. You never signed anything. Their own plat map draws the association boundary 40 feet inside their own line. This road isn't shared infrastructure, it's yours, recorded in your father's name and now yours by inheritance and continuous use going back over 40 years. What they did to your irrigation line isn't a maintenance dispute. It's property damage, done without permit, without survey, and without any legal standing to act on land that was never theirs to begin with. She said it plainly, without theatrics, the way a person states a fact they've verified rather than an opinion they're hoping is true, and something in Thomas eased slightly at hearing it, not relief exactly, since relief would come much later, but the settling certainty of a man who had suspected he was right and now had a lawyer's careful confirmation sitting in black and white in front of him. Rosalind recommended two paths forward, one involving a formal cease and desist paired with a damages claim, the other slower and more thorough, building a documented record strong enough that when Denise Holloway overstepped again and Rosalind was confident there would be no ambiguity left for anyone to hide behind. Thomas chose the second path. It was, after all, the only kind of path he'd ever known how to walk. What followed over the next several weeks was not confrontation but preparation, a quiet architecture of proof built one careful layer at a time. On Rosalind Cho's advice, Thomas installed 4 weatherproof trail cameras along the property line, the kind normally used for tracking deer movement, mounted high in the white oaks that had survived the skid steer's damage, angled to cover the gravel road, the culvert crossing, and the section of fence where the patrol's trucks most often idled. He kept a written log alongside the footage, dating and timestamping every incident by hand in a spiral notebook. Rosalind had suggested he start noting license plates, names when he recognized them, and the exact wording of anything shouted or posted publicly about him. It wasn't paranoia. It was method, the same patient method his father had taught him for keeping cattle records and tax receipts, applied now to a different kind of accounting. The footage accumulated quickly, and it told a clearer story than any letter had. There was Gary Pruitt, the retired adjuster, photographed on a Sunday morning standing on Thomas's side of the property pins. Rosalind had a licensed surveyor, a methodical man named Neil Ostrander, reflag and certify that same week, taking photographs of Thomas's cattle and posting them to the Millbrook Facebook group with a caption calling the operation an eyesore dragging down everyone's home values. There was Ashley Cobb, filming a rambling monologue from her truck window about illegal farming operations, a claim easily disproven by the county's own agricultural exemption records, which Thomas had held without incident since 2001. And there was Denise Holloway herself, twice captured on camera directing Pruitt where to park equipment for a second round of access maintenance she'd scheduled without permit for late June, a plan Thomas and Rosalind now had advance knowledge of, thanks to a leaked copy of the HOA's internal work order that a sympathetic board member, uneasy with how far things had gone, had quietly passed along to Curtis Weaver, who passed it along to Thomas. Rosalind moved fast once that work order surfaced. She filed for and received an emergency restraining order barring any Millbrook-affiliated individual from entering Thomas's property or disturbing the access road, had it formally served to Denise Holloway by the county sheriff's office 5 days before the scheduled equipment arrival, and made certain this part mattered enormously. She stressed to Thomas more than once that everything from this point forward was done by the book, filed through proper channels, served through proper process, so that nothing Thomas did himself could later be characterized as an overreaction or a vigilante response. "We don't need to be aggressive," she told him. "We only need to be exact. Exact wins." Denise, it turned out, either didn't believe the order would be enforced or didn't believe it applied to her, a distinction that, in the end, made no practical difference. On the morning the skid steer arrived, trailered in behind Gary Pruitt's truck with Ashley Cobb already filming for what she clearly intended to be a triumphant neighborhood broadcast, Thomas was waiting on his own porch with Rosalind's paperwork in hand and a call already placed to the county sheriff's non-emergency line, exactly as instructed. He did not raise his voice. He did not step off his own property line. He simply held up the restraining order where Denise could see it through her windshield and said, in the same even tone he'd used for every letter and every citation for the past 4 months, that she was in violation of a court order and that law enforcement was already on its way. Denise laughed at him. It was, witnesses would later recall, because by then a small cluster of neighbors, drawn by Ashley's live broadcast, had gathered along the roadside, a short, sharp, dismissive laugh, and she told Pruitt to keep unloading the equipment, insisting loudly for the camera that this is HOA-directed maintenance on shared infrastructure and he has no legal authority to stop it. The skid steer's engine started. Its bucket lowered toward the same stretch of road it had gouged in June. And it was at that exact moment, with the machine's treads just beginning to roll and Denise Holloway standing in front of her own audience with her arms crossed in triumph, that Deputy Ray Solano's patrol car turned onto the gravel road, lights on, and brought the entire scene to a sudden and very public stop. What happened next, captured not just on Thomas's trail cameras but on Ashley Cobb's own phone, still recording, still streaming to the 1,600 members of a Facebook group who would spend the rest of that afternoon watching Denise Holloway's certainty come apart in real time, would become the turning point that everyone in Millbrook Farms would still be talking about months later. Deputy Ray Solano was not a large man, nor an especially imposing one, but he carried the kind of unhurried, methodical calm that Thomas recognized immediately as a mirror of his own, the calm of someone who had learned that facts, laid out patiently enough, rarely needed raising a voice to make their point. He stepped out of his cruiser, told Pruitt to shut the skid steer's engine down, and asked, simply, for someone to explain what was happening. Denise answered first, and answered fast, launching into the same language she'd used at the May meeting and in a dozen Facebook posts since: shared infrastructure, community standards, non-compliant property. But Deputy Solano cut through it with a question so plain it seemed to catch her off guard. "Ma'am, do you have a permit for equipment work on this road?" She didn't. She said something about the HOA not needing a county permit for its own maintenance, and Solano asked, just as evenly, whether this was, in fact, HOA property. Denise hesitated, and in that hesitation, captured clearly on Ashley's still-rolling phone camera, replayed later by hundreds of Millbrook residents who had never before seen their board president at a loss for words, something in the crowd's mood audibly shifted, a low murmur rippling through the dozen or so neighbors who'd gathered along the fence line to watch. Thomas, for his part, said almost nothing. He handed Solano the restraining order, the surveyor's certified boundary report from Neil Ostrander, and a copy of the 1997 plat map showing Millbrook's actual recorded line, all of it already organized in a folder Rosalind had prepared for exactly this moment. Solano read through it in under 2 minutes, looked up at Denise, and asked her to step away from the equipment while he sorted out the property boundary himself, on foot, with a handheld GPS unit from his cruiser. It took him 11 minutes to confirm what Rosalind's paperwork had already established. The disputed stretch of road sat entirely within Thomas Greer's recorded property line, a full 38 feet outside any boundary the Millbrook HOA could legally claim. Denise was cited that afternoon for violation of a restraining order and trespassing, Gary Pruitt for operating equipment without a permit, and the skid steer was left idling, useless, on a strip of gravel that had never belonged to the patrol in the first place. But it was what came after Deputy Solano left that truly unraveled things, because the county, once formally notified of unpermitted equipment damage to a private easement, sent out its own civil engineer the following week, a careful, unassuming man named Priya Nakamura's colleague, Dennis Okafor, tasked simply with assessing the extent of the road and culvert damage for the county's records. What Okafor found went beyond the June damage Thomas had already documented. Buried records at the county planning office, cross-referenced during his inspection, revealed that the shared infrastructure designation Denise had cited in every letter and every meeting did not exist anywhere in Millbrook's actual recorded covenants. It had never been filed, never been approved by the county, never existed outside of language Denise herself had drafted and inserted into HOA newsletters roughly 8 months earlier, shortly after she'd taken the board presidency. Okafor's report noted something else, almost as an aside, that would prove far more damaging than the boundary dispute itself: a set of county records showing that Denise Holloway had submitted, under her own name, an application the previous year to extend the Millbrook subdivision's platted boundary to absorb an additional 4 acres along the northern edge, Thomas's northern edge, an application that had been quietly denied by the county planning board in late 2023 for lack of proper title, but which Denise had apparently never disclosed to the HOA board or membership she represented. It was Curtis Weaver, still quietly sympathetic and still quietly connected to a board member growing more uneasy by the week, who first heard whispers of the denied application, and it was that same board member, a soft-spoken accountant named Phil Ostrowski, who had grown increasingly uncomfortable watching Denise wield the patrol like a personal instrument, who eventually forwarded Rosalind Cho a set of internal HOA emails he'd found while reviewing the association's financial records for an unrelated audit. The emails, dated across several months, showed Denise describing Thomas's land not as a compliance concern but as the parcel we need for the new clubhouse pond expansion, and referring to the ongoing citations, in her own words to Pruitt, as pressure to get him to sell before we go through the annexation route. It had never been about landscaping. It had never been about shared roads or fence lines or firewood. It had been, from the very beginning, about acquiring Thomas Greer's land quietly, gradually, through manufactured pressure rather than an honest offer, and building him into a villain along the way so that no one in Millbrook Farms would think to ask too many questions about why. The emails changed everything, and they changed it fast. Phil Ostrowski, unwilling to sit on what he'd found, brought copies to the next HOA board meeting and read them aloud without warning, watching Denise Holloway's face go pale under the same fluorescent lights where, 2 months earlier, she'd stood at the podium painting Thomas Greer as the neighborhood's problem. The room that had once nodded along with her now sat in a silence that felt, by every account Curtis later gave Thomas, far heavier than any argument could have been. Neighbors who had liked Ashley Cobb's Facebook posts, who had murmured agreement at the May meeting, who had simply gone along because raising a hand costs nothing and going against a board president costs plenty, began instead posting their own quiet corrections to the group, clarifying that they'd never actually seen any wrongdoing on Thomas's part, that the cattle operation had always had proper permits, that maybe, in hindsight, none of this had ever added up the way Denise insisted it did. A neighborhood turned slowly, and then all at once. The lawsuit Rosalind Cho filed on Thomas's behalf sought damages for the irrigation line, the culvert, the trees, and punitive damages tied to the trespassing and the fraudulent shared infrastructure claims, and it went to civil trial 9 weeks later in the county courthouse, a modest brick building Thomas had passed 1,000 times without ever imagining he'd sit inside its courtroom. Rosalind built her case the way she'd built everything else, methodically, without theater, walking Judge Miriam Faulkner through the 1997 plat map, Neil Ostrander's certified survey, the itemized repair invoices, the trail camera footage timestamped against the restraining order violation, and finally the internal emails Phil Ostrowski had turned over, each document entered without a wasted word. Denise took the stand in her own defense and tried, for nearly 20 minutes, to characterize the annexation emails as informal brainstorming, insisting she'd never intended to pressure anyone, that the citations had been issued in good faith, that the equipment work had been a misunderstanding about boundary lines that any reasonable person might have made. It fell apart under cross-examination almost immediately. Rosalind asked her, plainly, why a misunderstanding about boundary lines required a certified survey to correct if the lines had genuinely been unclear to her, and asked why her own emails referred to pressure to get him to sell if the citations had truly been issued over landscaping concerns and nothing more. Denise had no answer that held together, and the courtroom, Thomas would later say, went quiet in the same way the HOA meeting had gone quiet weeks earlier, the sound of a story finally running out of road. Judge Faulkner's ruling, delivered 11 days later, was thorough and unambiguous. She found in Thomas Greer's favor on every count, ordering Denise Holloway personally liable for $6,000 in property damages, an additional $15,000 in punitive damages tied to the deliberate misrepresentation of HOA authority in the fraudulent infrastructure claims, and full coverage of Thomas's legal fees. A homeowners association, she wrote in her decision, possesses only the authority granted to it by its own recorded covenants and the boundaries of the property its members actually own. It cannot manufacture jurisdiction through repetition, and it cannot dress a private acquisition scheme in the language of community standards and expect the law to look away simply because the language sounds civic-minded. Mr. Greer's patience in the face of sustained harassment does not diminish the seriousness of what was done to him. If anything, it clarifies it. The fallout inside Millbrook Farms moved quickly after that. A petition for Denise's removal from the board, circulated by Phil Ostrowski, gathered enough signatures within a week to force an emergency vote, and she resigned 2 days before that vote could formally remove her, a distinction that satisfied almost no one. Gary Pruitt and Ashley Cobb quietly stepped back from the patrol, which the newly reorganized board dissolved entirely within the month, replacing it with nothing at all. Curtis Weaver, somewhat to his own surprise, was asked to fill the vacant board seat, and one of his first acts was drafting a formal written apology to Thomas Greer on behalf of the association, delivered not by mail this time, but in person, on Thomas's own porch, over coffee. The road was repaired that autumn properly this time, permitted and inspected, the irrigation line replaced, the culvert reset, and 2 of the 3 damaged white oaks saved by an arborist's careful pruning, though the third was lost and a new sapling planted in its place near the fence line, a small thing that Thomas found he cared about more than the money ever mattered. The cattle stayed. The hay came in on schedule. The trail cameras came down in October, their job finished, and the folder marked Millbrook correspondence was moved from the kitchen table to a drawer, thick with everything it had needed to be and nothing more. In the years that follow, when Thomas Greer walks the fence line his grandfather first drove into the Georgia clay in 1951, he does so the same way he always has, unhurried, mostly silent, more interested in the state of the pond and the health of the timber than in anything anyone once said about him in a meeting he was never invited to. Land like this doesn't ask to be defended loudly. It only asks that someone stay patient enough and honest enough to keep the proof.